So we continue this unit of the course with Friedrich Nietzsche, who is in many ways an anti-modern modern, like Rousseau was an anti-enlightenment figure. I'll try to explain that as we go through the reading for this week, which is the second essay of the genealogy of morals. Now, last time we talked about Baudelaire and the search for intensity, the cultivation of intensity, and the fact that for Baudelaire there was no foundation for encounters, for aesthetics. There was no foundation for the practice of art. That instead it was the practice existed on its own as a way of living, a way of being in modernity. And for Nietzsche too, the abandonment of foundations is really key to understanding his contribution to the modern and the postmodern. Now, I often say to you in this course, if you know one sentence by a thinker, what would that sentence be? Beginning of the class, I think we talked about Descartes, and if you know one sentence of Descartes, you know, I think, therefore I am. In Rousseau, when you started the course, you might have said, man is born free and is everywhere in chains. And when we read the discourse, it's the first discourse, he talks about the arts and sciences putting flowers over the chains with which we are laden. Remember in Marx, if you know one sentence in Marx, it's probably the history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggle. And in Nietzsche, if I said to you out there in the internet land, what is the one sentence of Nietzsche you know, you would a chorus of internet users would exclaim, God is dead. Right? That's the sentence that people know about from Nietzsche. And so I want to spend the very beginning of this talk on what does that mean? What is Nietzsche saying with God is dead? If you know one sentence of Nietzsche, it's this: God is dead. Probably, anyway. That's what I've seen in the bathrooms. That God, it's a short sentence, and it is a key concept for Nietzsche, just like for Descartes. I think the FRAM is so key. What does God is dead mean? For Nietzsche, it means that there is no ideal. There is no standard, no endpoint, no divinity, no forms, no noumenal, no history with a capital H, nothing against which we can measure ourselves and our creations. That is Nietzsche's radical thought. When Nietzsche says God is dead, he is saying there is no ideal that we can use for our thinking or our actions. And we must live in a world without such a standard and without romantic longing or despair about such a standard. Nietzsche wonders, does the world ever make sense without some notion of an ideal against which we measure it? Are we ever fully in the world? Is that in childhood or in love or in moments of ecstasy? That's what Nietzsche is trying to think through. So God is dead is less about theology, although it certainly has ramifications for theology, than it is about trying to say that philosophy, ever since Plato, has been on the wrong track. Hegel said he was the fulfillment of philosophy. Marx thought Hegel was on the right track, but Marx was the fulfillment of philosophy. Nietzsche says philosophy shouldn't be fulfilled. It's always been mistaken, ever since Plato screwed up Western history. He writes a book called The Birth of Tragedy and the Spirit of Music when he's a young professor, in which he argues that it's Socrates. After Socrates, it's all downhill for Western culture. Because Socrates made us serious and made us think about inquiry and what we call critical thinking, when we should have been actually just trying to merge with the world, explore our own power. act, not reflect. And after Socrates, for Nietzsche, it's all downhill. God is dead. What does Nietzsche mean by that? Well, I want to suggest to you that what Nietzsche means by that is that there is no ideal. There is no ideal realm that will function either as a telos or as a foundation for what we do. And let me explain that a little bit. Remember when we talked about Kant, we talked about the noumenal and the phenomenal. And that Kant said that the phenomenal world was what we could understand through science, but things in themselves, the noumenal world, was what we had access to through faith. And Kant, in doing that, was picking up on this long philosophical tradition that goes back at least to Plato, which tried to understand how what we encounter in the world, what we see in front of us, how is that related to the way things really are. Right? In Plato's metaphor of the cave, what we see around us is just shadows. Shadows, they're illusory, but we need something more fundamental than that. We need something to ground what we do in the world. We need something that will allow us to make legitimate judgments. He called that the realm of the forms, or sometimes we're called ideas. And for Plato, philosophy moves you along a divided line from these illusory everyday activities or objects or perceptions. Philosophy moves you from those things toward the ideal, towards the real essential things. Those are your foundations for the appearance out in the world. Christianity can also be put in these terms. Christianity has the logos, the truth, the word made flesh. So as Plato took you up the divided line, if you're a philosopher, you go up the divided line towards the ideal, Christianity says God will send his only son down that line, back down to earth. Incarnation of truth is what Jesus is. Jesus is the incarnation in this framework, the incarnation of the logos, of the divine, of the ideal. Jesus makes the truth flesh, and of course is crucified for doing so, but promises that we will make the journey with him through his love back to the ideal. So again, you have the ideal and the real. In Plato, the ideal is supposed to give us a foundation for the real. In Christianity, the ideal, God's love, the divine, salvation, that is the promise that our real lives will have meaning. Our real lives in the end of day will have some foundation, some truth with a capital T. You get to Kant, you see the ideal is this noumenal world, which functions separately from, or alongside, perhaps I should say, alongside the phenomenal world. But again, the ideal is there as a security, as a framework that guarantees the phenomenal. We talked about how in Hegel, Hegel says that truth is what emerges in history. So for Hegel, history with a capital H is how the ideal is realized over time. That we begin to incarnate truth. We, normal human beings, begin to incarnate truth through history. So by the end of history, we are living truthfully. We are living the ideal. The ideal has to appear in history. But again, for Hegel, you need an ideal to show to be able to show what's right and wrong about what's happening in the phenomenal world. The ideal is history come to fruition. Okay. In Marx, similarly, you have this notion of the species being. Remember from the 1844 manuscripts that there's an ideal way for human beings to exist, and that we live in contradiction with that. Alienation is our contradiction with our essential being, and that contradictions have to work themselves out. So again, the ideal, like in Hegel, the ideal emerges in history. We start to live the ideal over time. In all of these occasions, and we can multiply them but again and again and again, there's this relationship between the ideal and the real, where the ideal functions as a secure framework or foundation or goal for the way we live in the phenomenal world. When Nietzsche says God is dead, he means there is no ideal. That you don't need a legitimation, you don't need a goal, you don't need a foundation, you don't need a framework. That all of those things are just excuses to keep us from living with our strength, to keep us from living forcefully, to keep us from intensity. That in fact, there is no framework, no ideal, no goal. There has never been one. That we can dispense with the framework of Western philosophy. That is Nietzsche's claim. That is his radicalism. And the stories he tells are stories that are supposed to liberate us from a desire for the ideal. Like in this genealogy of morals, where he tells us the story of how morality is constructed, not in order to approximate some ideal thing, but morality is constructed to keep us from acting according to our strength. And we can dispense with that. We can dispense with these inhibitions because they are just the products of this disease, the disease of trying to justify ourselves through an ideal. The ideal is no more. That's what he means by God is dead. So last time we talked about the ways in which Nietzsche overturns this philosophical tradition of establishing some relationship between the ideal and the real. And today we want to go on and talk about the text assigned for this week, the second essay of Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals. The quotation I want to start off with today is from the Genealogy of Morals. Nietzsche writes, "Every art, every philosophy may be viewed as an aid and remedy in the service of growing and striving life. They always presuppose suffering and sufferers." Every art and philosophy always presuppose suffering and sufferers. And what Nietzsche is trying to get at in the second essay of the Genealogy of Morals is how suffering and sufferers establish the notion of guilt and how guilt functions to deny strength and to deny what we called last time intensity. Every art, every philosophy always presuppose suffering and sufferers. So two parts to that quotation. The first is that you should judge a philosophy by how it helps, if it helps you be more alive. Very important. It's not about it corresponding to reality. It's not about it matching the world. It's about its enlivening, its invigorating possibilities. The second is invigoration of some will cause suffering. And that there's just any attempt to escape that will be deadening, will not be enlivening. Suffering is part of the process of invigoration. Now, we didn't assign for this class the first essay of the Genealogy of Morals, but I do want to give you just one notion from that first essay that as background to our discussion today, and that is the notion of resentment, or sometimes people use the French word ressentiment. Resentment for Nietzsche is a very important concept because it shows this, what you can call a dynamic of reversal. A dynamic of reversal. Nietzsche says, once upon a time in the ancient days, there was no distinction, no moral distinction between good and evil. There was just this distinction between good and bad. Strong people, noble people said, I am good. People who aren't like me are bad. You start with, I am good, because you have a self-esteem, you have strength, and then you move on to looking at people who are different from you and saying, those people, they're bad. And Nietzsche says what happens over time is that the weak who see these noble, strong folks and say, oh yes, they are good, I am bad, they eventually process a reversal by which they say, why am I bad? Why am I bad? Well, I'm bad because that guy up there is good. That guy is strong. That strong, good person makes me feel bad. Why do I feel bad? I feel bad because I don't have what that strong person has. I don't have that power, that intensity. That power and intensity makes me feel bad. that feeling of self-denigration, of worthlessness, eventually he used to say, the weak person to say, what makes me weak? It's the aristocrat, it's the strong person, it's the mighty. That is evil. That what makes me feel weak is evil. And suddenly, the weak person says, all those strong people, those blonde beasts, the popular kids, the folks who seem to have it all, those are evil. Why? Because they have it all and I don't have it. They're evil because they have what it takes to be successful, to dominate others. That makes them evil in my eyes, my weak eyes. So who am I then? Well, if they're evil, I'm not like them. I must be good. What Nietzsche is trying to chart out here is how a moral distinction comes from the denial of strength. That's his point here, is that the moral distinction comes from the weak trying to denigrate the powerful. And for him, that is a reversal of nature, and it's a reversal of the kind of intensity that he wants to see cultivated. He talks in that first essay about how the lambs look up at the birds of prey who are killing lambs and eating them and saying, "Oh yes, those birds of prey are evil. Those birds of prey are evil. So we must be good. We lambs, we meek, we weak creatures." And then he jokes that, yes, the birds of prey say, you are good. Yeah, you taste good. That somehow the strength, the intensity, the viciousness of the birds gets coded as evil because it is a way that the weak protect themselves against strength. Morality, for Nietzsche, is the way the weak protect themselves against strength. Here from the Genealogy of Morals, Nietzsche writes, to demand that strength does not express itself as strength, that it must not consist of a will to overpower, a will to throw down, a will to rule, a thirst for enemies in opposition and triumph, that is as unreasonable as to demand that weakness express itself as strength. Nietzsche is trying to make a case here for calling out the importance of strength and intensity as against morality, which he thinks is leading his society to greater and greater decadence. His society, I should say a word about that, I suppose. His society is a German-speaking Europe in the latter third of the 19th century. Now, this is a time when many people in German-speaking Europe are feeling that everything is going smashingly. Germany, as you probably know, some of you know, is unified as a country in 1871 after having military triumphs first against Denmark and then against Austria and then eventually against France in 1870. And there is this nationalism and euphoria in German-speaking Europe spread among many social classes and people of different political views, all of them thinking, see, we have triumph. We have this modern German state. We are overcoming our old divisions. We have a new modern moral system that works for us. And Nietzsche is very much against all of that. And across German-speaking Europe, even people who are anti-nationalists, like the university students and the liberals and the socialists, they're like, it's hard to root against the winning team when they speak your language. And Prussia seems to be the winning team. They're doing all these and even Bismarck is even giving gifts to the left, and they say he creates national health insurance. Bismarck did, a conservative politician way back when he was. There's lots of things to make sure that he promotes domestic peace, and so there's an enormous amount of nationalism and cheerleading for German superiority, and Nietzsche is appalled by this. He thinks it's disgusting. He thinks it's a sign of the ultimate decadence of Germany, is that they are winning these wars, promoting business. The achievements of the German economy and military seem to Nietzsche to be evidence
of its cultural decline. Because what you're creating is a bourgeois culture that will always reward mediocrity at the expense of greatness.
Nietzsche is very much against this wave of appreciation that's sweeping over Central Europe. He is very critical of this so-called German state, which he thinks is imposing a kind of bourgeois morality on the majority of Europe, a bourgeois morality that again substitutes guilt, conscience, and convention for strength and intensity. So Nietzsche is, in some ways, like Rousseau, as I said last time, he's this anti-modern modern. He understands modernity very well, but he's against its development. And he's against its development because he thinks that development is predicated on control by the weak of the strong, the control of intensity. And the second essay in the Genealogy of Morals that we've read for this week is about how guilt works to control us. You can't have guilt, Nietzsche says, without memory. And so the second essay is really starts off by asking how you can create memory in the human animal. He writes, if forgetfulness were not present, there would be no happiness. If forgetfulness were not present, there would be no happiness, no cheerfulness, no hoping, no pride, no present. Nietzsche is a champion of forgetfulness. The man in whom this repression apparatus is harmed and not working properly, he writes, we can compare to a dyspeptic. He is finished with nothing. That is, you have to be able to forget, to be finished with things, to let it go, to not hold on to the past. But what bourgeois morality does, what Christian morality does, is to create memory in the human animal so that we can carry around our past, carry around our guilt. And Nietzsche says we do this by burning in values. He wants to show us that moral values from the Ten Commandments on, moral values are not ideals that we accept intellectually, that we accept spiritually. He says, no, we burn those values in. How much blood, he says, and horror is at the basis of all good things. Torture and cruelty make morality stick. That's where the memory comes from, because punishment makes the human animal remember these values. And he talks about, in my edition on page 67, he talks about a festival of cruelty. That is, that suffering goes together with morality, because when we have moral values, we want to see those who violate those values suffer. And suffering, he thinks, is the underbelly of morality. This is what he says in the second essay. To see others suffer does one good. To make others suffer even more. This is a hard saying, Nietzsche writes, but an ancient, mighty, human, all too human principle to which even the apes might subscribe, Without cruelty, Nietzsche writes, there is no festival. So again, what Nietzsche's doing here is to say, it looks like sweet, good morality, but it's really the triumph of the weak over the strong. It looks like deep spiritual values, but it's really cruelty that institutes a moral code that we are afraid to violate. And he goes on in talking about how this emphasis on cruelty is not for him a pessimism. This emphasis on cruelty is a realism, trying to underscore the true nature of the values to which we subscribe. Nietzsche doesn't think that his emphasis on the history of suffering and how guilt and moral values come hand in hand with cruelty, he doesn't think that makes him a pessimist. He actually thinks facing up to the reality of the pleasures we get from suffering, from cruelty, actually opens up the horizon for us. He says that the sky gets darker over human beings when we're ashamed of our desires, when we're ashamed of our practices. And shame, he thinks, is a great inhibitor on intensity. He sees the development of morality as a struggle against senselessness.
He writes, what really arouses indignation against suffering is not suffering as such, but the senselessness of suffering. So what he sees morality as trying to give some purpose to the suffering that is a part of life, to give it some a framework. And the framework he talks most about in the second essay in the Genealogy of Morals is the creditor-debtor framework. That is, when we violate the moral law, we are in debt. We create a debt. We have to pay back. We violate some rule. We have to pay back. We're in debt, and the society becomes our creditor. And so the question becomes for Nietzsche: how do we burn in the sense that I owe something to society, to my community, because I have violated its rules, that I am in debt to it? And religion keeps us in debt to God, to the moral code. So we're always paying back, and therefore, for Nietzsche, never able to liberate ourselves to live with real intensity, because we're always feeling we owe something to somebody.
Society sets up situations where you will be the debtor, because society is the ultimate creditor. And a strong society is a society that can say, forget about it. You did something really bad. You're at Wesleyan. You get 2 points. Or 4 points now, right? You're just thinking about you get points. Out in the world, you get beaten up by a policeman. But here, you get points that you can protest about. And if you protest about it, we'll give you some more points. And so because the community is so strong, we don't really care. But then when something happens that we really do care about, I don't know, something bad, violence of some kind, let's say. Violence of some kind. We say, you're out. And people say, oh, what do you mean I'm out? I can't be out. No, you're out. You're suspended or you're expelled. Because the community is not strong enough to actually have some people acting really violent, let's say. They're just not strong enough. Whereas other communities might, let's say if this was a really big university, maybe the first time that happened, it wouldn't be expelled. For Nietzsche, the ability to tolerate transgression is a sign of strength. Okay? And the community is the ultimate creditor.
And for Nietzsche, that feeling of being in debt, that feeling of owing something to someone, keeps us in line. And that, he thinks, is really the function of morality, is to make us mediocre, to keep us in line, to keep the strong from expressing their strength. Now, you might say, people did certainly say to Nietzsche, come on, there are some moral rules that are natural. There are laws that the just and the unjust that are part of the fabric of the world or part of the fabric of nature. And Nietzsche will have none of that. Nietzsche says that these rules, the notion of just and unjust, these conventions, they are established social norms, and they have no grounding beyond their establishment in social practices. He writes, setting up of the law is the setting up of the notions of just and unjust. To talk of just and unjust in themselves has no sense whatsoever. That's really important for Nietzsche. To talk of just and unjust in themselves has no sense whatsoever. It's obvious that in themselves, harming, oppressing, exploiting, destroying cannot be unjust, Nietzsche writes, insofar as life essentially works that way. Life, he says, in its basic function, harms, oppresses, exploits, and destroys. You can't conceive of life without those things. The notions of just and unjust are imposed by human beings on life so as to control life. There are no values in themselves. Values are social constructions that we develop to control people, to ensure that, from Nietzsche's perspective, that the strong don't express their strength.
Morality is an expression of power, and in the first essay of the Genealogy of Morals, which is an account of morality. You've only been assigned the second essay. In the first essay, he says, he does say that morality is an expression of power, but it's really perverse in the West because it is the power that the weak have seized over the strong. Morality is just a cover that the weak use to protect themselves against the strong.
This notion that these things are socially constructed, that they have no foundation in themselves, means for Nietzsche that in order to understand values, in order to understand anything really, you have to understand its historical development. There are no entities in themselves outside of history. As he writes, today it is impossible to say clearly why we really have punishment. All ideas in which an entire process is semiotically summarized elude definition. And here's the part I want you to remember. Only something which has no history is capable of being defined. Only something which has no history is capable of being defined. And what Nietzsche's doing, will be later called deconstruction by postmodernists. What Nietzsche is doing is showing how what we take to be a natural order, what we take to be a God-given set of values, is actually historically put together for particular purposes of control. And again, for Nietzsche, the control of strength, the control of intensity. Punishment then exists in order to create a memory that will inhibit further action. And punishment, he writes, doesn't make us better human beings. Punishment makes us more like domestic animals. Punishment takes away our wildness. He sees that taking away of wildness, that taking away of strength, as an illness. He writes that conscience is an illness. He says, Nietzsche says, I regard the bad conscience as the serious illness that man was bound to contract under the stress of the most fundamental change he ever experienced, which occurred when he himself finally enclosed within the walls of society and accepted a kind of peace. That is, for Nietzsche, bad conscience comes when we are forced to live together and no longer have, if you will, that wildness. When we are force ourselves to be like pets to one another, domesticated animals. Now, the problem with this for Nietzsche is that although we act like domesticated animals, here we are in Germany in 1875, we're acting like, everyone is a pet to one another. Although we act that way, Nietzsche thinks we still have these instincts. We still have these desires that are ready to explode. And they have to go somewhere, that they have to find some outlet. All instincts, Nietzsche writes, that do not discharge themselves outwardly turn inward. This is what I call the internalization of man, Nietzsche writes. Thus it was that man first developed what we later call a soul. What he's saying here is that by denying our instincts to act, to be cruel, to break out of our conventions, by denying those instincts, we force them into other cavities, other channels, and that means they begin to eat away at us. They begin to eat away at us. Freud will have much the same view later on. That is, that when we deny instincts, as for Freud, sexual instincts, they begin to eat away at us, causing us psychological pain. For Nietzsche, they eat away at us, causing us to become distorted animals who don't know our own strengths. And so for Nietzsche, in the morality that he is tracing out, morality becomes a kind of self-torture. Conscience from Nietzsche is a self-torture, and the guarantor of that process, the being that we appeal to guarantee our self-control, our self-torture, the being that we appeal to ensure that our moral system has an anchor. This is the imaginary being of God. Nietzsche writes, he sees in God the ultimate antithesis of his own ineluctable animal instincts. Man reinterprets these very animal instincts as a form of guilt against God. This thought becomes a kind of torture to him. God has, the perfection of God is the antithesis of our own animal nature. And our inability to actually be like God was used as a stick to beat ourselves with. It is used for Nietzsche as a form of self-torture. What is the cost of this? Nietzsche says, have you ever asked yourself sufficiently how much the erection of every ideal on earth has cost? We modern men are the heirs of the conscience, vivisection, and self-torture of millennia. We are the victims of this self-torture. So what we see in Nietzsche is this analysis of morality as the accretion of control, the denial of instinct and intensity, and what we see is his attempt to show that what we had considered ideals are really symptoms of our self-denial, of the denial of our animal nature. Our ideals are an expression of a symptom of our psychological sickness, not a foundation for our lives. At the end of the second essay, he does ask, can change happen? Is it possible for human beings to actually break out of this? And he answers very equivocally, he says, I don't know, maybe possible that a great figure can come and liberate us from this morality, but he's not willing to actually sketch out, as Marx did, any process for change. Instead, what Nietzsche is doing is to show you that God is dead, that the ideals that we've been worshiping, the conventions that keep us under wraps, are really symptoms of an illness of bad conscience and self-torture that we could leave behind if we were not so concerned in fitting in and erasing our possibilities or effacing our possibilities for acting with difference and with strength. We began this week with Baudelaire, who wanted to break away from the aesthetic forms of his predecessors, creating these prose poems that were a hybrid of all different kinds of things, to break away from forms that he thought filtered out some of the most interesting, powerful, exciting, vital parts of modern urban life. In Nietzsche, Nietzsche's also concerned with this filtering out of vitality, the filtering out of energy, the filtering out of strength. Nietzsche thinks that what we had considered our highest ideals, our most spiritual values, were actually symptoms of an illness, symptoms of our fear of our own strength. And that if we can break through of those conventions, we have a possibility not living as a creditor, not living as a debtor, but actually living fully in the world by breaking away from these conventions, that ideals were just conventions. Remember, if we even go back to Flaubert, Flaubert's great enemy was bourgeois convention, right? The style of life that held everybody together in some kind of calm homogeneity. Flaubert thought that was the cultivation of bêtise, of stupidity. He has that in common with Baudelaire and Nietzsche, but Flaubert's antidote to stupidity was to write the perfect sentence, was to make a great work of art. That was Flaubert's antidote to stupidity. Baudelaire's was to kind of break through and live with a kind of vibrancy and an openness to experience. Nietzsche's is to dissect, deconstruct ideals, to show that ideals are symptoms of a self-denial, symptoms of an illness that makes us fit in, that gives us rewards for being part of a society, but at the same time denies our most energetic animal nature. Nietzsche wants to liberate us from our morality and from our pursuit of foundations. He wants to have us realize that the things we're taught that are most precious are actually symptoms of our fear of our own strength. We'll see as we go on in the course that this attack on foundations, looking at foundations of society as merely conventions of control, that will be a thread that runs from Nietzsche right to the present, right to Foucault and contemporary social theory. And Nietzsche is really crucial for contemporary thinkers because of his anti-foundationalism. Baudelaire, too, was against any foundations, but Baudelaire enacted his anti-foundationalism through poetry. Nietzsche analyzes philosophic ideals to show that they are mere symptoms of a historical decline, and a historical decline that creates more and more mechanisms for control, convention, mediocrity. All of those things, control, convention, mediocrity, are the enemies we've seen from Flaubert, Baudelaire, and now Nietzsche. And we'll go on in the next weeks to see how those play out in some of the other artists and philosophers we'll be reading. See you next time.